those tablets came back to Addis. There was jubilation, and and these objects are now in the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, beautifully displayed, and so forth. And
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do they know what tablets are?
No.
Why did they take it to begin with? Just because?
Well, they were looting, and they found these things in the church and so forth. I mean, I suppose the British Museum curator must have known. And the British Museum now recognizes that they are sacred objects that are part of the ritual, and has made it clear that it will never show them to the public, and it will never allow anybody to research them. So only Ethiopian Orthodox priests can watch them. And so, in a sense, they are pointless from the point of view of the museum's mission, which is to enlighten the public and enable research. So there is actually a clause in the British Museum Act of 1963 that says that if objects are unfit for purpose, they can be deaccessioned. And so there's a campaign now, I can come to that in a minute, but to try and get them to return that. But just to go back just a second to what happened. So Afromet was quite successful and got these objects to be returned. And including Lord Napier, who was the head of the expedition, his descendants, even more recently in 2018, actually gave an amulet which was supposed to be that of Alemayo, I think, and a scroll, and so these objects came back and have been returned. And a more recent initiative that happened now that you were asking me about 150 years afterwards. So the 150th anniversary of Magdala was in 2018. It was 1968. So 2018 was 150. And Gondar University had a conference, and some of us went there, and we went to Debre Tabor and then to Magdala and saw the place. And it was very, very interesting, lots of papers. And then the Ministry of Culture said, well, why don't we set up a restitution committee? And it was Professor Hirut at that stage, Minister of Culture and Tourism. And she went on a visit to London. And the Imperial War Museum in London had in its display case a lock of hair of Emperor Theodorus. And she said, come on, you can't have human remains in this day and age of an emperor in your display case. And the Imperial War Museum, to their credit, they immediately took it off their web page, they took it out of display, and then there were negotiations with the Ethiopian embassy, some very good diplomats there, His Excellency Ambassador Teferi, and they discussed with the museum, and then they agreed the lock of hair should be returned. And by then, Professor Hirut had been replaced by her namesake, Dr. Hirut, same name, and she went to England and came back with this lock of hair. So that was a first big step. And then, sort of coincidentally, so this restitution committee, National Heritage Restitution Committee, was established, and a bunch of us were on there, some historians, the great-grandson of Emperor Theodorus, people in positions of authority. There was the Gondar University president and others, the Ministry of Culture and so forth. Started to think, well, how do we try and work on this agenda of restitution? And the serendipitous thing that happened was that we set up this group of foreign advisors and people in UK and diaspora people in America and so forth. And then there was an auction being held in UK, and it was 3 beautiful beakers, horn beakers, and a manuscript and a cross. And these were clearly Magdala, looted from Magdala. It actually says on the silver of this was taken from Magdala. And so the Ambassador Teferi and Dr. Fraser, they started negotiating with the auction house, and auction house said, no, we're not going to return them, we're going to sell them. And gradually, when there was social media and so forth, and they were convinced. And so the last day before the auction was stopped. And then there was a question, well, how do we negotiate with the auction house? And again, fortuitous circumstances, there's a foundation called the Scheherazade Foundation with the CEO Tahir Shah, and he heard about this, and their objective is to create cultural dialogue and so forth. And they said, well, we could purchase these objects at the base price from the auction, which they did. They negotiated and bought the objects. And then they went went even further and bought objects from Belgium, as you mentioned, and a beautiful shield and crown and another cross and various other objects, a scroll and so forth. And at a ceremony in London in September at the Athenaeum Club, these objects were handed over to Ambassador Tafari, and then more recently he brought these objects back. And then coincidentally, just a month later in Belgium, there was another auction, and a similar thing happened. The ambassador there wrote to the auction house and they said, no, these objects were not looted, we're not going to sell them, we're not going to stop the sale, it's going to go ahead. The day before, and they even said we've consulted our lawyers and so forth, the day before, they agreed to stop the auction. And then a Dutch businessman who invested in Ethiopia, who wants to remain anonymous, he bought the objects and they were returned, and so the 16 objects were returned there. And then there was another auction in America. And this time it was a museum. Can you imagine? In California, Palm Springs Museum. A beautiful neck cross and a manuscript. And they were going to sell this in an auction. You know, a museum that has, was very rich. And what were they selling these for? Well, to help them for their collection. I mean, pointless. And again, the same kind of thing happened. And there's a pressure group in America, the American Association, Ethiopian Association, Diaspora Association for the Preservation of Cultural Restitution. And they put pressure, and that auction has been stopped. And then we had two other recent returns, which were from America. One was an Orthodox Greek US painter, icon painter. And he saw online, he saw a cross, beautiful Ethiopian cross being sold. He bought it and he said, well, I want to give this back. And it was returned. And then more recently, one of the diaspora, Ethiopian, Bamalakot Tawahda, his father was from a governor in Harar, and he had a lot of photographs from Americans and archives who were here, and he brought these back. And he had a friend who was a US serviceman in Eritrea who had bought a beautiful sword with Emperor Menelik M written on it. And this sword had traveled around the world with him. He had bought it when he was in Kanyo in Eritrea, the military base, from some dealer. And he liked this sword. And he traveled. He went to the Philippines, he went there. Everywhere with him, the sword went around the world. So this object had traveled the world, and after 56 years, he says, this has to come back to Ethiopia. So nice. This has come back. So the restitution committee has been lucky. There have been these circumstances, and then where, there are new initiatives. So Ambassador Tafari went to discuss with the British Museum about the tabots, and there was even a debate in the House of Lords with 5 lords in the upper chamber of the British government that actually clearly stated the moral grounds that these tabots, these sacred holy objects, should be returned. There was no reason to keep them. And of these 5 lords, 2 of them, one was currently a bishop and one was a former archbishop. So, and the government side was floundering in trying to respond to this. And so now the pressure is mounting. And when the Aksum obelisk, when people would laugh at my father and his colleagues and saying the Aksum obelisk will come back one day, never, they would say. But if you knock on the door long enough, so someday it will open. And,
absolutely. Absolutely.
So there's that. And then just one other thing I think is important to say is that, I think the restitution thing needs to be thought of very much in terms of collaboration, cooperation, joint work. It's not a thing of, this is ours, we need it back, that kind of thing. Because that creates a break in relations. Whereas what you want is to bring history alive and create relations. So one thing that's being attempted now is, for instance, there's a cross in Cape Town that's been recently discovered from Magdala in the cathedral there, and there's another one in a church in UK. And so the Patriarchate here is discussing the idea of giving a cross in return and in exchange. So you create that relation. And then also, museums. So the British Library is already helping with the digitized manuscripts. And, if there's a need to for training of museum people, for joint projects and conservation. So there's some beautiful dresses of Empress Truwork, like yours, the traditional dresses with very, very beautiful embroidery. They're very delicate materials, and they have in the Cambridge Museum. The Cambridge Museum, in theory, would be willing to return them, but they need to be preserved carefully and so forth. So the knowledge and sharing and so forth. And, I think the time is right with the questioning of the role of museums and colonialism, and with the Black Lives Matter, and with the movement against the statues of the slave raiders and so forth, and with the movement of the indigenous peoples and the first peoples. The idea, it's a restitution age in my view. It's the time is ripe where people can rethink it, and then it becomes a joint project where you're doing things together, where history comes alive, where young people begin to know about it and learn across cultures, and we rethink that whole period. And the objects have their own lives, and some of them, obviously sacred objects, are still part of the ritual, such as the taboos. Can you imagine that Westminster Abbey, the most important church in the UK, holds hostage a tabut of a sister Christian church? Can you imagine? It is there, and it has been hidden away because they are too ashamed and embarrassed of it. Wouldn't it be better if it comes under the Queen, and wouldn't it be better if they made a gesture of returning that? And in exchange, I'm sure Ethiopia will offer them something in exchange. And so I think this idea of the gift, the return gift and exchange in anthropology, I'm coming back to my subject area, but there is this idea of the gift, and that is that if it is a one-way process, it breaks the relationship. But if you have the return gift, it creates an ongoing relationship. And so that's what I and some of my colleagues in the Restitution Committee, I work closely with both the international advisors and the committee here, and having this kind of making it an exciting project of not just blame, atonement and recognizing wrongs, of course, but at the same time building new relationships and rethinking history in more interesting ways and more fruitful ways.
That's very true. So do we even know how much was looted? Do we even know what's out there?
Regarding the Magdala loot, on what is in the museums has been inventoried by Andrew Heavens, and he was a journalist here, and he has just written a book which is about to come out in June called The Prince and the Plunder, which is about the story of Prince Alamayo, and he has made a very detailed inventory of all the objects in the different museums in Scotland, in various parts of the UK, and even outside Britain, but that's in the collections that are in the museums. But what is with the descendants of the soldiers, it just comes up occasionally in auctions and so forth, so we don't really know. And as for the Italian occupation, there are Badoglio and Graziani, they loaded up over 100 boxes each when they left, and we still don't know. There's a throne of Emperor Haile Selassie that was recently discovered there's a Rastafarian group in Italy, and they discovered a throne in one of the churches. And there's lots there, but the treaty after the war said that Italy would return everything within 18 months. And the only things that were returned, the Lion of Judah statue in front of the train station, and then some paintings in the parliament and some archives. But, the Aksum obelisk took a long time, and then there's so many other things there.
Yeah, well, what a shame. Can you enlighten us on your participation with Young Lives research with the Oxford University?
Yes, so I've been working for Young Lives now for I think 12 or 13 years, and it's a research project that is carried out in 4 countries, in India, Peru, Vietnam and Ethiopia. In each country we've been following 3,000 children. 2,000 were born in 2000, so they're now 21 years old. And there was an older group who were 7 when we started, so they're now in their late 20s. And we've been looking at everything about their lives, from birth and nutrition and early learning and education, and then as they go through school, and then what happens, the difference between the boys and the girls, the equal numbers of boys and girls, between the rural urban areas in different regions of Ethiopia, between rich and poor. And as they grow up, what happens with school, with children's work, and then marriage, forming relationships, having a household, and then having children and so forth. So it's a very broad study that has come up with some really quite important findings. For instance, we were able to show that by following the children, that children who'd been malnourished when they were young and still manage, quite a number of them, to catch up. And before that, people have thought once they're malnourished in the early first 1,000 days of their life, then they're never, that's the end of them. So that was really a very positive finding. And then we've looked at, by comparing the 2 cohorts with 7-year gap apart at ages 8, 12, 15 and so forth, we can see changes. So we could see that there was, in terms of access to schooling, that the younger ones had better access to schooling than the older ones. But in terms of quality of education, there had been a decline and so forth. So we can look at everything from early marriage, and so we've done work on violence affecting children, we've done work on children's work and labour, we did some sub-studies on urban relocation, moving to condominiums, we did work on the safety nets and food security. So we've looked at all kinds of different elements of these young people's lives as they grow up. So that's a sort of the longitudinal aspect of looking at young people's lives.
How important is it to discuss Ethiopian issues in the global media in terms of books and films?
Well, I've been fortunate enough to have been able to work with my students and my colleagues to work on a number of different topics. And what I've enjoyed has been mentoring students and working with colleagues on particular topics and then trying to publicize that. So one of the areas that I've worked in is on customary justice. And that started with a trip with my students and some other professors to the south of Ethiopia, near the Kenyan border, and Chowbahar, the salt lake. And you can imagine it, there was mountains on one side where the Hamar live, and mountains on the other side where the Boran live. And then there's a small group called the Arbore, they call themselves Hor, and they are peacemakers between these bigger groups, and there were 7 groups that had been fighting. Wow. And they held this peace ceremony for 3 days. My father had been in the US and he came back with a video camera, a small video 8 camera, which he gave me. So I happened to have the video camera on me when this was happening. And so for 3 days we were there and I was filming. And the first day they were having these debates under the trees in the shade, and everybody, and they have this thing where you allow somebody to speak as long as they want. And even in the Borana custom, you repeat the last bit of what the person said, to show that you're listening. And so they they reached some kinds of agreements and so forth. And then they had the ceremony. It was incredible. They blunt the spears. And the ritual woman leader there anoints the hair of the ritual male elders with butter. And then they also have these long sticks with which they do the blessings. And this film, which you can see, and she was anointing these, and then they blunt the spears with rocks, and then they break the spears and put them in anthills, and then they curse war and bless peace, and they do it each in their different languages and different way of doing it. And I did this simple film, and then with the daughter of Ivo Strecker, Professor Ivo, we made a small film, but it was could be good for students, but not a proper film. So Ivo came back with a proper film crew and interviewed the people who did it, in particular Grazmash Sura, amazing old man, about how they planned it, what they did, and so forth. And he made this film called Bury the Spear, which won an award at in Paris at the Bilan du Film Ethnographique. And then it got forgotten. And then more recently, we thought, it would be good to make an Ethiopian version of this film, an Amarinya version. So we went back down to Arbore with Ivo and Tesfahun, a filmmaker, and we went to the place where Grazmash Sura is buried. And his son, Hora, he speaks Amarinya fluently, Oromia, Hammer, Arbore, Dasanach, everything. And we went to the site where his father would die. In the meantime, my father had died, his father had died, and we were talking there about this and talked about peacemaking and this kind of thing. And there had been war in the meantime again and again, peacemaking efforts and so forth. So a new version of the film with subtitles by Amarinya was produced, and we were thinking of showing this film, and then there was war here and it was in the country, and so not an appropriate time. We're hoping to show it very soon. So just to say that this working with students on a particular project is really important. And that led me, in that particular case, there was an interest from the Ministry of Justice. And they said, the courts are overloaded with these backlog of cases. And they approached the French Center of Ethiopian Studies and they said, we'd like to see whether the customary justice can help. So they got in touch with me, and with my colleague, Dr. Getachew Asafa from the law school, what we did is we paired one anthropology student and one law student, and together each one went to each of the different regions. And they did a little survey, and then they did a case study. And we produced a book, Grassroots Justice, the Contribution of Customary Dispute Resolution. And so, one thing leads to another. And so this working with students also, I worked with students on the question of resettlement and migration. And then with colleagues, we published a book called Moving People in Ethiopia on displacement issues. And I worked with Forum for Social Studies, which is a think tank here, and we did some work on natural resource management with the University of Sussex. Again, working with colleagues, with Dr. Iraswork, Dasalin Rahmatu and others, and did a book on natural resource management. And so this, for me, the ethic of working with colleagues and with students is what I really enjoy. And all the different projects I worked in. Another one was on craft workers, on marginal minorities of craft workers, and how, like in the caste system in Asia, the potters and the ironwork smiths and the tanners, and you see here these pottery. My father got very interested in the monasteries in North Showa of the Gadam of Bala Ij, who make these beautiful potteries, and they are excluded. And so again, we wrote a book that was called Living on the Edge, and about these marginalized minorities. And I had students, and 16 students went to different parts of South Ethiopia and described how the potters and the tanners and the smiths are marginalized in their particular community. And we then edited it into a book with another colleague of mine. And then another thing I strongly believe in is publishing locally first. So that book was published here as Living on the Edge, and then we worked on it a little bit more and improved it. And it was published in the UK by Hearst under a new title called Peripheral People, Ethiopia's Excluded Minorities. So I do try very much to make sure that work that I do is published first here. And one of the other longitudinal studies, that's another thing I really enjoy, which is not doing, so many studies are just one-off things of one particular topic or just one area. So, I occasionally have done some work on particular topics, like I did a bit on HIV/AIDS or other things like that, or on the Adur. I was really fascinated by these burial associations and tried to understand how they started. So that's a particular topic. But more broadly, so Young Lives was looking longitudinally at children and how they grow up and all the issues there. And then another project was called Well-Being, Ill-Being Dynamics in Ethiopia Wide. Mm-hmm. So that started with the University of Oxford Centre for the Study of African Economies, where economists were following 15 villages in different parts of the country, and they were looking at what was happening. And we did, with my anthropology students, we went and looked at what these places were like. And then we kept on following. So it's 20 communities over 20 years and how they have changed. And we produced a book called Changing Rural Ethiopia and various other books. Also trying to publish in Amharinya, which I have not been very good at, and so we did translate some of these books. And Rural Ethiopian Transition, we have an Amharinya version of that book. And again, working with colleagues, over 100 Ethiopian students and colleagues have worked with me over the years on this project. And that's been following different communities in different regions and different lifestyles, and seeing how these places have changed. And they've changed dramatically over a generation beyond recognition. The way that roads, mobile phones, electricity, health services, education, from the period we started looking at them in the early 90s till the late 2010s, these places are no longer the same places. Urbanization has changed them tremendously. And so, you know, when you look at things over time on a longer period and you see changes, some of them worrying, you know, greater inequalities growing in these communities and so forth.
You mentioned the excluded minorities. Can you tell our young audience a little bit about the history and your research on them?
Sure. You know, another thing that's quite interesting in the way that I've worked is, you know, you look for funding to do some research on something and you go wherever there is. And in this case, it was some NGOs, Oxfam and Novib, and they were quite worried about the way that marginalized groups of artisans were discriminated. So they helped us to do the research. And I worked with my students, and we each one went and made a description of the ways in which the potters and the tanners and the smiths are marginalized. And in many of the societies of South Ethiopia, they're not allowed to marry with the rest of society. They cannot eat with people. They're often given roles which are considered, you know, they may be the butchers or the grave diggers. They, you know, are not respected, and, you know, even to the extent that utensils they drink with will be broken. There was really very serious discrimination against them. And so it changed.
It's not because they're physically or there's anything wrong with them. It's just because of what they chose to do.
That's right. Or what they chose or what they happened to be doing, and the division of society into the farmers and the artisans and the hierarchical societies in the Southwest in particular. They were considered to be at the bottom of the hierarchy. So you had the nobility, and you had the army, and then you had the farmers, and then below them you had, in some cases, slaves, and in some cases the artisans were even lower than the slaves. They were really considered as almost subhuman in some ways. So understanding how that worked in different communities and how that was changing and why and how that can be promoted and those kinds of things was quite common. And even now in Kachene, you can see it, the discrimination. And there was recently, the Institute of Ethiopian Studies had an Israeli anthropologist, Malka, who presented a film about called Nafkot, which we showed at the Society of Friends of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, in which I'm part of the committee. And so, because I had an interest in this topic, I was very keen that this should also be shown.
So it's still going on.
It's still ongoing. It changes, and one of the interesting things is when they do better, then people begin to respect them. And with the land confiscation during the Derg and reallocation, some of them got land, and some of them had double income from the land and from artisan work, and some did quite well, and some migrated to towns and set up. So in Gurage, there are areas where the craft workers are doing really well, and some places like Waliso, even the smiths have transitioned to modern equipment and so forth. So when they do well, people like them. It's a bit like the Asmaris, the minstrels. So the minstrels were also discriminated against and looked down on and so forth. But when they became popular singers and were recording and became wealthy, then people do marry them.
They were accepted, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's a shame. This is going to be our last question. Your amazing father once wrote, "Don't trust the Ferengi, even if they come with aid." Do you know what he meant?
Well, I think again it goes back to his mother and the way that she was concerned that the big powers were still trying to keep their hands on Ethiopia, and she thought that was wrong and campaigned against that. And when they dismantled, the British dismantled some of the infrastructure that the Italians had put in Eritrea in the ports and so forth, and she rose an upcry against that. And so I think as a historian who looked at the 19th century, which he focused on, he was very aware that the big powers were trying to still lay their hands on Ethiopia, and was very concerned about that and always very wary about that. He called me Alula. And, Alula was a war hero, but he was also a very brilliant strategist. And he was very aware that the Italians were devious. And I think, I'm not a historian, but there is the view that Emperor Menelik was somewhat more conciliatory towards the Italians. Perhaps Taitu was not. She was a shrewd diplomat and also a nationalist. But Alula was quite aware and sent out spies to watch what the Italians were doing and so forth. So I think, it's probably in that context that, Richard was writing his economic history, which he dedicated for Alula, and he was writing at that time when I was born. And so I think for him, the idea that you should be wary of foreigners probably is something he inherited and believed strongly.
Yeah, we have to agree with him now.
So children's stories, I'd like to just mention that at some point. Yeah.
Please do.
Sorry, unless there was other things?
No, that was my last question, so please.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think, one of the things I'm very happy about is having worked with a group, we called ourselves Writers for Ethiopian Children. And the concept we had was BBB, I think it was called, back-to-back bilingual books. So the idea was that we had the stories, each one of us wrote a story, either in English or in Amharinya. We helped each other translate them and prepare them together. And there was Firmaye, the poet, and Mike Daniel Ambacho, both of whom died, and my friend Tasfaye and others. And we had this small group and we produced these stories. And so when you look at the book from one side, it's in English. And then when you look at it from the other side, the same story is in Amharinya. And we got friends to illustrate it. And these stories were also, we were hoping that students here who were fluent in Amharinya but struggling in English could actually read it that way. And also, we had the ambition that diaspora Ethiopian kids could, who were fluent in their English but struggling with their Amharinya could do it. Like that was the kind of a bit what we were trying to, but we wrote nine books together, and but that came to an end. And for me, it was also a little bit of a way to reflect, to write stories that connected to some of the things I was looking at in a more academic sense, but presenting it in a form for children's stories. And of course, our children were growing up at the same time.
So they got to read it too. That's lovely. So you're not doing it anymore? Why did it stop?
Partly, some of the strong members of the group, we lost them, died. Mike was really one of the engines of our group. 2 or 3 of them left the country. We started with the Goethe Institute, and there was a director and a German woman who was a writer for children it was a workshop. That's how it started. She gave us a workshop, and then we thought we must write together, and she wrote one of the stories. She left, the German Goethe Institute woman left, 2 of our members died, 2 emigrated, and so maybe it's something to come back to in retirement. But
are they available in the market?
They were being sold through Mega, and some of them are still around.
There. Yeah. Okay. So we would like to say thank you for giving us the opportunity and opening up this beautiful house for us to come and interview you on you and your family. It was a pleasure. So if you would want to say anything to our audience before we close.
For me, these are times for thinking and for peace and reconciliation and recognizing wrongs and wanting things to a hopeful new beginning. So that's what I hope that our country does move towards peace, reconciliation, and I think it's the time now for that kind of thing. I also want to say how pleased I am and how humbled in a way that you're interviewing me, because your mother was such a close friend of my mother and my grandmother even, and the role she played at my grandmother's 50th anniversary and had a film made. And of course, going back each generation, and your great-grandfather and my grandmother, and knowing each other in London. And so all these happenstances and circumstances, and yes, the serendipities of that is really nice. So I enjoyed the interview today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.